The dogs moved before anyone else did. That was the part no one spoke about afterward. Not the candlelight dinner, not the polished silver, not the way the Dowager Duchess had arranged the seating so that Lady Maren Ashford sat directly across from her son and caught the light in all the ways a mother could plan for. Not even the fact that Cassian Voss had worn his father's cufflinks for the first time since the funeral, which anyone with eyes in this house knew meant he was being serious about something. No. The thing that cut through every carefully arranged detail of that evening was the dogs. Rook moved first. He was the larger of the two wolfhounds, grey-brown with a scar along his left shoulder from a hunting trip 3 years ago, and he had the kind of quiet authority that comes from never needing to prove anything. He had been lying near the fireplace at the south end of the grand hall, close enough to the warmth to be comfortable, far enough from the guests to be polite. That was where Cassian's hounds always stayed during formal dinners. They knew the rules. They had always known the rules. Rook lifted his head, slowly the way he did when he heard something outside that he had not decided yet was a threat. Then he stood. Sable, smaller, darker, always watching Rook the way young soldiers watch a general, stood half a second later. Both of them crossed the room together, not fast, not slow, just purposeful. The kind of movement that made the two footmen near the east door glance at each other without saying a word. They walked past the table where Alara Voss sat at the head, already deep in conversation with Lord Ashford about something that involved land boundaries and a river. They walked past Cassian, who was listening to Lady Maren describe a garden party she had attended the previous spring, his face attentive in the practiced way of a man who has been raised to always appear attentive. They walked past the 2 empty chairs at the far end of the table, and then past those, toward the window where a young woman stood with a glass of water she had not yet drunk. Her name was Inez Caldwell. She was 26 years old, the ward of a distant relation of the Voss family who had died the previous autumn, and she had been invited to this dinner because the Dowager Duchess believed in the appearance of generosity even when she had no use for it. Inez had been placed at the table, then moved to the window when the final seating arrangement had required her chair for someone whose name actually appeared in the debrets. She had moved without complaint. She had taken her water glass with her and had been standing near the curtain for 20 minutes, watching the gardens go dark through the glass. Rook reached her first. He pressed his long nose against her free hand, once firmly, the way he did with Cassian when Cassian had been away for more than a week. Inez looked down at him. She did not jump. She did not make the soft, surprised noise that most people made when a dog the size of a small horse appeared silently beside them. She just looked at him, then reached down and placed her hand on the top of his head with the ease of someone who had spent a great deal of time around animals and had no need to perform it. Sable sat down at her feet, not curled up, sitting upright like she was on duty. Neither dog growled, neither dog acted strangely. They simply went there and they stayed. Across the room, Cassian stopped mid-sentence. Lady Maren had been saying something about roses, about a particular variety that bloomed only in late summer, and he had been about to respond with something acceptable, something a man in his position says to a woman in her position during a dinner orchestrated by his mother, when the words stopped forming and his eyes went to the far end of the room without his permission. He watched Rook Lane into the hand of the woman by the window. He watched Sable sit at her feet like a sentinel. He watched Inez Caldwell look down at his dogs with an expression he could not read from this distance, and he noticed, in a way that was slightly inconvenient, that she did not look pleased or flattered or surprised. She looked like someone who had been expected. Like the dogs had simply arrived at a conclusion she had already reached on her own. He turned back to Lady Maren. She was still talking about roses. He said something, he did not know what, it was enough. His mother had noticed, of course she had. Alara Voss noticed everything that happened in a room she was responsible for. She had noticed the dogs cross the floor and she had noticed her son's eyes follow them, and she had filed both of these facts in the part of her mind she kept for things that required management. She did not stop talking to Lord Ashford. She did not look at Inez. She simply reached for her wine glass and made a quiet, private decision that the girl's stay would be kept short and comfortable and entirely without opportunity. The dinner continued. The candles burned down 2 inches. A course was brought out and cleared. Someone laughed too loudly near the door. Lord Ashford made a remark about interest rates that his daughter pretended to find interesting. Cassian refilled his wine glass once, which was once more than he usually did at these things. At the far end of the room, near the darkening window, Inez Caldwell drank her water and kept her hand resting on Rook's head, and did not once look toward the center of the table. She had learned, a long time ago, that looking at things you could not have was a particular kind of punishment you inflicted on yourself. She had learned this at 14, when the family she had lived with after her parents died had made it very clear, in all the ways that families make things clear without saying them aloud, that she was a guest and not a daughter, and that these were not the same thing. She had learned it again at 19, when a young man she had thought understood her had chosen, reasonably and practically, a girl with a better situation and a warmer family. She had learned it a third time when the woman who had taken her in after that, a kind and genuine woman named Mrs. Caldwell, whose ward she had legally become, had died in her sleep on a Tuesday in October and left Inez with a small inheritance, no living connections, and a letter of introduction to the Voss estate written in Mrs. Caldwell's careful, slanting handwriting. She did not look at cash and Voss because she was not a person who wasted her attention on things that were not available to her. This was not sadness, it was architecture. She had built her life on it. But she looked at the dogs. Rook had the most honest face she had ever seen on any creature, human or animal. There was something in his eyes that did not perform anything. He looked at you and meant it, and that was all, and it was enough. Sable was more guarded, but she had chosen to sit, and in Inez's experience the choice to sit with someone was never accidental. Animals were not polite. They did not stay out of obligation or social arrangement. If Sable was sitting at her feet, it was because Sable had decided something. Inez had no idea what she had decided. She was not going to flatter herself by guessing. The dinner ended the way these dinners always ended, with the men moving to a different room for a conversation no one pretended was about anything other than money, and the women gathering near the fireplace with tea they may or may not have wanted. Ilara Voss guided Lady Marin to the best chair near the warmth with the practiced grace of a woman who had been running households since she was 19. Lady Marin sat beautifully, which was something she was genuinely good at. She had the kind of poise that looked effortless and was not, and Inez, standing slightly apart with her tea, watched her and felt nothing except a mild, honest respect. Lady Marin Ashford was exactly what she appeared to be. That was rarer than most people realized. A woman named Charlotte, who was some kind of cousin to Lord Ashford, came to stand near Inez with the particular energy of someone who had run out of better options for conversation, and had decided Inez would do. She talked about a cousin's engagement, about a dress she was having made, about a book she had started and not finished. Inez listened and responded in the right places and thought about whether there was a morning coach she could take that would get her to the town by midday tomorrow. She had no particular reason to stay past the month. The letter of introduction had gotten her here. Politeness had kept her for 3 weeks. There was nothing holding her beyond that. Across the room, Lady Marin was saying something to Ilara Voss that made the older woman smile in a way that reached her eyes. It was a rare expression on Ilara's face, and it told Inez everything she needed to understand about how this household was going to look in a year's time. Good, she thought that was a good thing. It was. She drank her tea. Later, walking back to the small guest room she had been given on the east side of the house, she heard footsteps behind her and thought for one strange moment that it was someone following her. She stopped. She turned. It was Rook, padding silently down the corridor with his ears low and his expression earnest, and behind him, Sable trotting to keep up. She stood in the hallway and looked at them. "You should go back," she said quietly. She did not know who she was saying it for. Rook sat down. Sable put her nose against Inez's knee and then also sat down. Inez looked at the two of them for a long moment. Then she opened the door to her room and went inside. She did not invite them in. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and listened to the sound of 2 large dogs settling down outside her door with the decisiveness of animals who had made up their minds about something and had no interest in being talked out of it. She did not know what to do with that. She lay down. She stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of the men's voices from somewhere below, the low murmur of people talking about the things men talk about when they think no one important is listening. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell. She thought about the letter. She thought about the fact that she would need to find a situation soon, something that paid, something that used the skills she actually had, which were organization and attention, and a capacity for managing complicated households that nobody in a complicated household ever thought to ask her about because they were too busy noticing that she had no title and no connection, and no particular reason to take up room in a room that was already full. She was not angry about this. Anger required the belief that things could have been different, and Inez had made a careful peace with the shape of her life. She had a small inheritance, she had practical skills, she had a mind that worked. These were more than many people had, and she knew it. She closed her eyes. Outside the door, one of the dogs shifted, then settled, then went still. She slept. In another wing of the house, Cashin Voss sat in a chair that had belonged to his father, and looked at a glass of something he had poured and then not drunk, and tried to remember the last time Rook had gone to someone he did not know and stayed. He could not remember it. He was not sure what that meant. He was fairly sure it meant something. He picked up the glass and drank it and went to bed, and told himself very firmly that the morning would be clearer, which is the thing people tell themselves at night when they already know that clarity is going to make things harder, not easier. Morning came. He was right. It did not help at all. The house was already in motion by the time he came down, which was early enough that the kitchen was still producing its first sounds, and the light was the pale, thin kind that does not commit to anything. He dressed without calling for anyone. He had done this since childhood, driven his valet slightly mad with it, never seen the point of needing someone else present for the act of putting on clothes. He went downstairs. He did not go toward the breakfast room. He went toward the back of the house, where the door to the grounds led out near the old apple orchard, and he pushed it open and walked out into the cool morning air with his hands in his pockets, and the particular feeling of a man who is going for a walk, because he needs to think, and walking is the only honest excuse he can make to himself. Rook was not at his heel. That was the first strange thing. Rook was always at his heel in the mornings. It was a 10-year routine, older than half the people currently staying in the house. Cashin stopped, looked behind him, no dog. He stood in the middle of the path that ran between the orchard and the kitchen garden, and felt, absurdly, slightly disoriented by this, the way you feel when a thing you have never thought about because it has always been there is suddenly not there. He walked on. He came around the corner of the garden wall and stopped again. Inez Caldwell was kneeling in the kitchen garden with her sleeves pushed up, doing something careful and deliberate to a row of what appeared to be seedlings that had been planted too close together. She had a small tool he could not name, and she was working with the concentrated quiet of someone who was entirely inside what they were doing. Her hair was not arranged the way it had been at dinner. It was pinned up simply, with a few pieces coming loose near her face. She was not dressed for visitors. She had clearly not expected to encounter anyone. Beside her, Rook sat with the contented heaviness of a dog who is exactly where he wants to be. He had not heard Cashin approach, neither had she. Cashin stood at the corner of the garden wall and watched for what he later estimated was somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes, which was long enough to understand something about a person that a dinner conversation over rose-colored candlelight might take 6 months to reveal. She worked methodically. She checked her progress against something she seemed to be measuring in her head. Once she made a mistake and took it back without any visible frustration, just a quick adjustment and a return to the work. She spoke to Rook twice, not in the voice people used when they thought speaking to a dog was charming, but in the ordinary tone of someone having a quiet conversation with a companion they trusted. He did not know what she said. He was not close enough. He turned around and walked back the way he had come, through the orchard, back to the house, and up to the breakfast room where his mother was already waiting with the morning correspondence arranged in her particular order of urgency, and Lady Marin Ashford across from her, looking fresh and ready and exactly like what she was. He sat down, he ate, he said the things he was supposed to say. Later he would spend a great deal of time examining that morning walk, looking for the moment he should have done something differently. He would not find it. The honest answer, which he was not ready to look at directly for some time, was that there was no moment to find. The thing had simply been true, quietly and without announcement, and the walk had been the first time he had been close enough to the truth to feel the temperature of it. He passed the salt to Lady Marin. She thanked him. His mother talked about the afternoon's plans. He listened and responded, and was, by any measure a person watching from the outside would use, a perfectly attentive and reasonable son doing exactly what had been arranged. He did not think about Inez Caldwell and the seedlings and the methodical quiet of her. He thought about it entirely. Alara Voss had built her life on the correct reading of rooms, and she had been doing it since she was 16 years old and had understood, in a single clear moment at a family dinner, that the people who controlled what happened were not always the ones doing the loudest talking. She had married well. She had maintained the estate through 2 difficult financial periods that her husband had not lived to see resolved. She had raised a son who was, by any reasonable account, a good man, which was harder than most people understood because good men were not born. They were constructed, slowly and carefully, out of principles applied consistently over time. She was proud of Cashin. She was also aware that he had his father's particular blindness, which was the tendency to find something honest and feel loyal to it even when loyalty was not strategically useful. His father had spent 20 years devoted to a business partner who had, in the end, cost them a significant portion of the river holdings. He had known the man was unreliable. He had stayed loyal anyway because the man had a quality his father called character, and his father had believed in character above almost everything else, including profit. Cashin had this same quality. It was admirable. It was also something she intended to manage carefully. The Ashford match was the right match. It was the right match not because Marin was exceptional, though she was capable, but because the Ashford family brought with them a set of connections and holdings that would resolve 3 separate financial pressures the estate was currently carrying quietly and at some cost to its long-term stability. Alara had done the mathematics many times. She had done them recently. The numbers were the numbers. Inez Caldwell was a pleasant young woman with no money, no family, no connections, and no obvious future. She had a quality that Alara recognized, a kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for depth, which it may or may not have been. She was here because Mrs. Caldwell, the woman who had apparently taken her in and called herself the girl's guardian, had been a woman who believed in asking for small favors without apology, and the letter she had written before her death had asked Alara to take Inez in for a month and help her find a suitable situation. A suitable situation, that was the phrase, not a place at the table, not a future in this house. A suitable situation meaning something practical and modest, a position perhaps, a household that needed a competent person. Alara had agreed because Mrs. Caldwell had done her a favor once years ago, something small but well-timed, and Alara kept her accounts. The month was almost done. The situation had not yet been found, not because Alara had failed to look, but because she had not looked very hard. There was time. There was also now a reason to move more quickly. She had seen the dogs cross the room. She had seen her son's eyes move without his permission. She was not going to be dramatic about it. She was not going to say anything or create a situation. She was simply going to write 3 letters before the end of the week, one of which would contain a genuinely good opportunity for a young woman of Inez's abilities, in a household far enough away to make regular visits inconvenient, and she was going to present it to Inez as the thoughtful gesture of a woman who had been keeping her obligations. She sat at her writing desk after the men had gone out for their morning walk, and Lady Marin had retreated to the morning room to write her own letters, and she thought through the logistics with the quiet precision of someone who had been doing this kind of thinking for 30 years. The first letter was to Mrs. Hartley in Devonshire, whose household accounts were famously difficult, and who had been asking Alara if she knew of anyone capable of managing them with discretion. The second was to a woman named Frances Cole in Yorkshire, whose elderly father had recently become difficult and who needed someone patient and organized to manage his affairs. The third she held in reserve, as she always held something in reserve. She dipped her pen, she began to write. Her handwriting was small and exact, the kind that takes years to develop and never quite loses the quality of intention. Outside, somewhere on the grounds, she could hear Cashin's voice saying something to the estate manager, something about the north fence. She could tell from the distance that he was near the orchard. She knew every corner of sound in this estate. She had lived here for 34 years. She kept writing. Lady Marin Ashford, in the morning room with her own writing paper and her own thoughts, was composing a letter to her younger sister that was cheerful and full and true in all the ways that letters to younger sisters are written to be. She described the house, which was genuinely impressive, and the Dowager Duchess, who was genuinely formidable, and Cashin, who was genuinely difficult to read in a way that she was still working out how to feel about. She paused over that sentence, crossed out the word difficult and wrote thoughtful, then crossed that out too, wrote considered, left it. She was not naive. She had not been raised to be naive, which was its own kind of education. She knew that this match had been arranged as much by mathematics as by feeling, and she had no strong objection to that because she believed that mathematics were honest in ways that feeling was not, or at least that the two could coexist without one canceling the other. She was willing to build something with Cassian Voss. She was willing to work at it. She was a person who worked at things. But she had also been watching him across 2.5 weeks of arranged proximity, and she was precise enough in her reading of people to notice when a man's attention was fully present and when it was covering for something else. Cassian was present. He was always present, but there was a quality to his presence that she had not been able to name until last night, when she had looked up from her roses and found him looking at the far end of the room. She had looked at the far end of the room too. She had looked at the two dogs and the woman by the window and the way the woman's hand rested on the larger dog's head without performance or self-consciousness. She had looked for a long moment. Then she had continued talking about roses. She finished the letter to her sister. She sealed it. She set it aside and picked up a second sheet and began writing something she intended for no one else, a private notation she sometimes made when she was working through a problem, a kind of dialogue with herself that helped her see the shape of something she was not yet sure about. She wrote, "He did not ask me anything real." She looked at that, then she wrote, "That may be unfair." She looked at that too. Then she wrote, "The dogs went to her without being called." She sat with that for a while. Then she folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her writing case, which she locked with a small key she kept on a chain at her wrist, and she went back to the ordinary business of a morning in someone else's house. She was going to handle this correctly. She was going to handle it the way her mother had taught her to handle things, which was with patience and full information and the particular calm that comes from having decided not to be afraid. But she needed more information, and she was going to get it. The afternoons at the Voss estate followed a rhythm that had been in place for decades, long enough that it felt like the natural shape of time rather than a set of choices someone had made. Lunch was a shorter affair than dinner, less formal, with the option to take it in the garden if the weather allowed. Afterward the household scattered by informal agreement. Lord Ashford usually retired briefly. His daughter walked or sat with Alara or wrote. Cassian dealt with estate business until around 4, when he would often take the dogs out toward the east fields if the light was good. The evenings reassembled everyone again. Inez had learned this rhythm in her first week and had adjusted her own habits to fit into its spaces. She rose early, before most of the household. She spent the late mornings in whatever corner of the house felt least occupied. She appeared at meals, spoke when spoken to, and retreated afterward with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly how much space she was entitled to take up and intended to take up no more. On the 4th Tuesday of her stay, which was the 3rd week into the Ashford visit, she was in the library. The library was her favorite room in the house, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was one of the few rooms in which being alone was expected rather than slightly unusual. You could sit in a library without someone coming to check on you. You could stay for an hour or two and emerge and nobody had missed you or wondered. It was one of the great social advantages of books. She was at the desk in the corner, which she had claimed by a series of small, consistent choices over 3 weeks, arriving first, leaving last, leaving a pencil at a particular angle. The desk was hers in every way except name, which was, she had found, usually enough. She was going through the household accounts. This required explanation, which the explanation was this. She had noticed in her 2nd week that the wine ledger in the dining room had a consistent error in one of its monthly columns, a small error, a number transposed, but the kind of thing that compounds. She had mentioned it once to the secretary, a pleasant man named Owen who managed most of Cassian's correspondence and clearly found the accounts the least interesting part of his responsibilities. Owen had thanked her and said he would get to it. He had not got to it. She had asked him 2 days later if he would like her to correct it. He had said with audible relief that would be very kind and had given her the full ledger. She had been working through it for 5 days. There were more errors than the wine column, not large ones, not dishonest ones, just the accumulated inattention of someone whose strengths lay elsewhere. She was fixing them quietly in the hours when she would otherwise be staring at the ceiling of her room thinking about coach schedules. She did not announce this to anyone. Owen knew, nobody else did, that was fine. She was 3 pages deep in the February accounts when she heard the library door open and understood from the sound of the footsteps that it was Cassian. She knew his footsteps. She had not meant to learn them. It had happened the way all the small, irrelevant things happened in this house, through repetition and proximity and a mind that catalogued without asking permission. She kept her eyes on the ledger. He came into the room. He stopped near the shelves on the far side. She heard him pull a book out, heard him stand there for a moment. She kept working. Then he said, "What are you looking at?" She looked up. He was holding the book but looking at her, at the ledger spread across the desk, at the pencil in her hand. His expression was curious in a way that was not unkind. "The household accounts," she said. The February column had a recurring transposition in the wine records. It was throwing off the quarterly total. He came a few steps closer, not close enough to crowd the desk but close enough to see Owen's work. "He's very good at correspondence," she said. That was not quite an answer, and they both knew it, and she watched him decide not to push it, which told her something about him that she filed away without meaning to. He looked at the ledger for a moment, then he said, "Did you find anything else?" "Yes," she said, "a few things, nothing significant, nothing dishonest." She paused. "The March totals are slightly off too. I can finish the quarter if you want it corrected properly." He looked at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, measuring, calculating, placing her in a category. Just looked directly, the way Rook looked at things when he was paying attention. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. Another pause. He was standing in the afternoon light from the tall windows, holding a book he had clearly not come in here to read, and she was sitting at a desk doing work that was not hers to do, and neither of them had an explanation for the particular quality of the silence between them that was not going to lead somewhere complicated. She looked back at the ledger. "I'll finish the quarter," she said. "It won't take long." He stood there for another moment. She felt it without looking at it. Then he walked to one of the chairs near the window, the chair that faced the desk at an angle, and he sat down and opened his book. He did not read it. She could tell from the sound of him, the stillness, the absence of any page turning for the next 15 minutes. He was not reading. He was sitting in the same room in the afternoon light with the presence of a man who had decided not to leave and had not yet decided why. She finished the February column. She moved to March. Rook appeared through the door that had been left slightly ajar, padded across the floor, and lay down at the base of the desk. Nobody said anything. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a bird did something brief and decided against it. The afternoon was long and still and full of things that were being said in the only language that had no words, which is the language of two people in a room who are both pretending to be somewhere else. She corrected the March totals. She found a discrepancy in the salt records. She fixed it. At some point, she realized he had turned a page. At some point after that, he turned another one. The light outside shifted from afternoon gold to the longer, quieter light of late day. She reached the end of March. She closed the ledger. She stacked it neatly, the way she stacked everything. She looked up. He was watching her. He did not look away when she caught him. "Thank you," he said, "for the accounts." That was what the words meant. She understood there was something else in them. She had no available response for the something else, so she answered only the words. "You're welcome," she said. She stood. She picked up her pencil. She walked to the door. He said nothing. She left. Behind her, she heard Rook get up and follow her into the corridor, and she stopped and looked down at him, and he looked up at her with his honest face, and she thought about how easy it would be to love a dog like this, how uncomplicated, how honest the whole arrangement. She walked back to her room. She sat down. She thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was her mind's polite lie for the fact that she was thinking about exactly one thing with the concentration of someone trying to see through water. She got up and looked out the window at the grounds going dark. She had 3 weeks left, maybe 2. She needed to use them properly. The day the formal announcement was being prepared, Inez was the last to know. This was not unusual. She was often the last to know things in this house, not because anyone intended to exclude her, but because she was not in the rooms where the information lived. She had accepted this as part of the architecture of her situation, the way she accepted most things, by finding its logic and settling into it. She found out the way she found out most things here, from the small signals a house sends when something significant is about to happen, the extra flowers in the drawing room, the good wine brought up from the cellar 2 days in a row. Owen moving quickly between rooms with the expression of a man who has a great deal of correspondence to send and not quite enough time. The housekeeper speaking to the cook with the quiet urgency of someone adjusting a menu. She pieced it together by mid-morning. By afternoon she was certain. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was nothing. She felt something. It was not large and it was not theatrical, but it was real, a small, clean discomfort in the center of her chest, like the first cold morning of autumn when you have not quite finished being surprised by it. She sat with that feeling for a while, in the honest way she tried to sit with difficult things, without dressing them up or minimizing them. Something had happened inside her over the past 3 weeks, something she had tried to be careful about and had not been careful enough about. She had noticed Cassian Voss in a way she had not intended to notice him, not his position or his house or the fact that he existed in a world that would always be slightly above and sideways from her own. She had noticed him, the way he handled disagreements with the estate manager, firmly but without cruelty. The way he read, genuinely, with the attention of a person who was still capable of being surprised by language. The way he had sat in the library that afternoon and turned pages and let the silence be the thing it was. She had noticed all of that, and she had told herself it was just observation, the natural activity of an attentive mind with time to fill. She had been mostly honest with herself about this. Mostly. The mostly was what was sitting in her chest now. She was not going to do anything with it. That was clear, it had always been clear, and the clarity was not painful so much as it was just the shape of the truth. She was going to finish her time here, accept whatever opportunity Alara Voss arranged for her, because she had no doubt Alara was arranging something, and go on to the next thing. This was how her life worked. Next things. She was good at next things. The dinner that night was the announcement dinner. She had known there were 40 guests coming. She had heard them arrive through the afternoon, the sounds of carriages, voices, the controlled chaos of a large household receiving company. She had dressed carefully, not because she was trying to make an impression, but because she had always believed that a person's visible effort was a form of self-respect, and she had self-respect in abundance. She was seated at the far end of the table, between a hard-of-hearing baron who had strong opinions about agricultural policy and delivered them to her at considerable length and volume, and an empty chair that had been assigned to someone who had not appeared. She arranged herself into the conversation with the baron. She agreed with him about drainage systems. She asked a question about crop rotation that she already knew the answer to, but that kept him talking happily for 12 minutes, which was 12 minutes during which she did not have to produce anything from herself. At the head of the table, Alara raised her glass. The room shifted, the kind of shift that happens when 40 people all move their attention in the same direction at once, a subtle collective holding of breath. Alara spoke. Her voice was measured and warm, precisely calibrated, the voice of a woman who had given announcements before and knew how to make them land. She spoke about the Ashford family, about connection, about the future. She spoke about her son in terms that were loving and exact. She raised her glass to Lady Marin Ashford, the future Duchess of Voss. The room applauded. Cassian raised his glass. His face did the thing it needed to do. Inez had seen it happen enough times in 3 weeks that she could identify when he was producing an expression and when he was wearing one. This was a production. It was a good one. Nobody would have seen it except someone who had spent an inconvenient amount of time watching him when she had no particular reason to. She clapped with everyone else. She did not look at him. She ate the fish course. The baron began a new subject, something about a road near his estate and the county council. She asked a question, she listened to the answer, the candles burned, the wine moved around the table. Lady Marin, at the center of it all, accepted congratulations with the gracious ease of a woman who had been preparing for this her whole life, and had always known she was competent to receive it. Cassian did not look at Inez. She knew this the way she knew where a door was in the dark, by the feeling of its absence. She did not look at him either. They were very good at this, the two of them, this particular kind of not looking. She suspected they had been practicing it from different sides of the same room for 3 weeks without quite admitting that was what they were doing. The baron had moved on to something about fishing. She asked what kind. He told her at considerable length. She was grateful for every word. After dinner in the drawing room, with the tea and the good china and the sound of women's voices layered over each other in the careful harmony of a formal gathering, Inez stood near a bookcase and watched Lady Marin accept congratulations from a series of women she clearly knew and liked. She watched her say something that made two of them laugh. She watched her reach out and touch the arm of an older woman in a gesture that was genuinely warm. She was going to be good at this. That was the truth. Lady Marin Ashford was going to be a good duchess. She was going to manage this house and its people and its obligations with the competent, measured intelligence of a woman who understood what she was for and had made her peace with the shape of that. Inez drank her tea. She thought about Devon. She thought about the letter she had not yet received, the opportunity she suspected was coming, the next thing that would ask her to be practical and capable and present in a household where she was useful but not significant. She thought about how good she was at being useful but not significant. She thought about Rook, who was not in this room because Cashin had given some instruction about the dogs before dinner, an instruction she understood the logic of even though the logic made her chest do the thing again. She finished her tea, she set the cup down gently. She was going to be fine, she was always fine. It was, she had decided a long time ago, the one thing she was going to be no matter what else changed. Because fine was a country she knew the map of, and it was small and not particularly beautiful, but it was hers, and it was stable, and she knew how to live in it. She left the drawing room quietly, the way she had learned to leave rooms without making it a thing. One of the footmen held the door. She thanked him. She walked down the corridor toward the east wing. Behind her, without her hearing it, someone opened another door, and then closed it again, and then did not follow. That night, after everyone had retired, and the house had settled into the quiet that large houses settle into after events, the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but is something more like a breath held, Cashin Voss could not sleep. He had tried. He had been in bed for what felt like a long time but was probably only 40 minutes, and the ceiling was the same ceiling it had always been, and the room was the right temperature, and there was no practical reason for the wakefulness except the one he was not examining. He got up. He pulled on the clothes he had taken off an hour ago, moving quietly out of habit, the habit of a man who had lived alone long enough to have formed habits around his own silence. He went out into the corridor. The house was dark except for the low burn of the hall lanterns. He walked without a destination, which was unusual for him. He was a person who usually moved toward things. Tonight he was just moving. He turned a corner, stopped. Rook and Sable were in the corridor outside Inez's room. Not scratching at the door, not restless, just there. Settled the way they were settled in front of the fire on a winter evening, with the particular quality of animals who have decided that this is where they belong and have no remaining questions about it. He stood in the corridor and looked at them. Rook turned his head and looked back. His expression was its usual thing, direct, honest, entirely without the ability to be polite about what it meant. Cashin leaned against the wall. He slid down it slowly until he was crouching, which was not a dignified position for a duke in his own hallway in the middle of the night. But dignity was a thing he found easier to maintain when there were people watching, and there were no people watching. He put his hand on Rook's neck. The dog leaned into it. He stayed like that for a while. He thought about the dinner, about his mother's voice measured and warm, about Lady Marin's profile in the candlelight, about the way she had accepted congratulations with exactly the right amount of grace. She was not cruel, she was not false. She was what he had been offered, and what had been offered was, by every calculation he could make, good. He thought about Inez in the kitchen garden, moving methodically through the work, not performing it. Inez in the library, correcting numbers with a precision that had no audience. Inez at dinner, talking to the Baron about drainage systems with the full attention of someone who had decided that if you were going to be present somewhere, you were going to be actually present. He thought about the morning he had walked around the corner of the garden wall and seen her there, and stood for 7 minutes, and then turned around and left without saying anything. He thought about the library, he thought about the silence. Rook was a dog who had never once made a mistake in this particular kind of judgment. In 10 years, Cashin had trusted these dogs through 3 different situations in which human intelligence had missed something that Rook had caught first. Once it had been a man on the estate who had been taking money in small amounts over 2 years. Once it had been a guest at a hunt who had proved later to be exactly the kind of person Rook had clearly thought he was. Once it had been something more personal, something Cashin had never told anyone. in which the dog's simple refusal to go near a person had turned out to be the clearest reading of the situation anyone had produced. He trusted these dogs. He had always trusted these dogs. They were at Inese's door, settled, not visiting, not curious, home. He understood what that meant. He had understood it since the first night they had crossed the room, and he had been carefully choosing not to look at what he understood, which was a thing he was very good at, because he had been raised by a woman who had high standards for the strategic application of not looking, and he had inherited the skill even as he had come to distrust its uses. He sat in the hallway. The house breathed around him. He thought about what was on the other side of looking directly at a thing. He thought about what happened after. He thought about his mother and the letters she had been writing at her desk with the small exact handwriting. He thought about what she was arranging, because of course she was arranging something. She was always arranging something. She was a woman of extraordinary competence applied to the task of making sure the future looked the way she had decided it should look. He thought about what it would cost. He sat with that. It was not a small thing. It was not a thing you moved through quickly. The cost was real, the disruption was real. The conversation with his mother was going to be the most difficult conversation of his adult life, and he was not a man who flinched from difficult conversations, but he was a man who understood that some of them changed the landscape of a relationship permanently, and you could not put the changed landscape back. He thought about all of that. Then he thought about the kitchen garden, the methodical work, the dog leaning into her hand. He stayed crouched in the hallway until his legs told him to get up, which took a while. Then he stood. He looked at Rook, then at Sable. He said nothing. What was there to say to a dog who had already understood something you were only beginning to admit? He walked back to his room. He did not sleep immediately, but he slept eventually, and when he did, he slept more solidly than he had in 3 weeks, which told him something he was going to need to be ready for in the morning. Morning came. He was ready, or close enough. Marin Ashford did not sleep as well as she usually did. This was notable because she was, by nature and habit, a very good sleeper. She had once told her sister that sleep was the most democratic thing available to anyone, rich or not, settled or not, certain or not, and she had always made use of it with the pragmatic commitment she brought to everything else. She lay down, she slept, she woke rested and ready. That night she lay down, she did not sleep, she was neither rested nor ready. She was sharp enough to know why. She had been watching Cashin Voss for 3 weeks with the same focused intelligence she brought to any situation she was being asked to commit to, and she had concluded several things. He was honest, which was not as common as it should be. He was thoughtful in the specific sense of a man who thought before he acted, which was rarer still. He was not unkind. He was not performing the engagement with anything she could call contempt. He was trying. But trying was not the same as arriving. She had been in rooms with people who were trying and people who had arrived, and she knew the difference because the difference was not in what you said or did, but in where your attention was when you thought nobody was checking. She had checked, she was very good at checking. His attention was on the correct places most of the time, on the dinner conversations, on his mother's plans, on the estate business he managed with quiet capability, on her when he was looking at her. But there was a frequency to his stillness, moments when he went very slightly elsewhere, that she had been tracking without entirely meaning to. And what she had tracked, being honest with herself in the dark of a room that was not yet hers, was that the elsewhere had a location. She was not angry. She had examined this carefully, and she was not angry, because anger required a sense of betrayal, and he had not betrayed her. He had not promised her anything yet except the public version of this evening, which was an announcement, not yet a full contract, and even announcements could be unmade if there was enough honesty available to unmake them. She thought about Inese Caldwell, whom she had watched from the beginning because Marin had always believed in watching the person in the room who was least likely to want to be watched, as that was usually where the true information lived. She had watched her at the first dinner near the window. She had watched her in the corridors, quiet, unobtrusive, present. She had watched her at meals, giving full attention to whoever was speaking to her, even when whoever was speaking was the Baron with his agricultural convictions. She had seen the library. She had not been inside it, but she had passed the door once during that long afternoon, and it had been very slightly ajar, and she had seen the angle of 2 people inside it, not close, not conspicuous, just coexisting in a room with a quality of mutual awareness that had no good explanation if you were being honest about it. She had kept walking. She had not mentioned this to anyone. Now she lay in the dark and thought about what she was building here, and whether it was the thing she actually wanted to build, or whether it was the thing she was very good at wanting, because she had been raised to want it. She thought about Cashin. She thought about Inez. She thought about the dogs because she kept coming back to the dogs, and she had learned to pay attention when her mind kept returning to something she had not consciously chosen to think about. She thought about the afternoon she had passed Rook in the hall. She had stopped. He had looked at her. She had looked back. There had been a moment in which she had tried to read him, and he had simply looked at her with the steady, uncompromising attention of a creature who had no capacity for social courtesy, and what she had seen in that look was not hostility. It was just not what he had for her. That was, she thought, a fair thing. That was an honest thing. She could not be angry at a dog for not having something for her. She could not be angry at the truth for being the truth. She was going to handle this correctly. She did not yet know what correctly looked like, but she had time, she had patience. She had, above all else, the discipline of a woman who had been raised to finish what she started, and she was not going to make a single move until she had full information and a clear sense of what she was actually choosing and why. She turned over, she closed her eyes. She thought, he did not look at me the way the dogs look at her. She thought, that is information. She filed it in the part of her mind she kept for things that required thinking about before she decided anything. She slept eventually, not easily but well enough. In the morning she came down to breakfast looking exactly as she always looked, which was to say composed and ready, and she sat across from Alara Voss and accepted the tea that was poured for her and talked about a matter of correspondence in a tone that revealed nothing about the night she had just spent, because she was Marin Ashford and she had been trained for harder things than this. She was going to need to talk to Cashin. Not today, not while she was still assembling the full shape of what she understood. But soon. The letter from Devonshire arrived on a Wednesday. Inez had been expecting something like it. She had been watching Alara Voss arrange things with the quiet efficiency of a woman who managed outcomes rather than waited for them, and she had understood for at least 10 days that the arranging included her. She was not resentful of this. The Dowager had made her a promise implicitly when she took her in, which was the promise contained in the phrase suitable situation, and she was keeping it. That was honest. That was the agreement. She took the letter to her room and read it there, sitting at the small table by the window, with the sound of the grounds outside and Rook stationed just inside the door in his increasingly proprietorial way. The letter was from a Mrs. Hartley in Devonshire. A household of moderate size, she wrote, with accounts that required a capable and discreet hand, and she understood from Lady Voss that Miss Caldwell possessed both qualities. The terms were fair. The household sounded manageable. Devonshire was a long way from everything she had known, which was perhaps part of the point and perhaps also part of the appeal. She read it twice, she put it down on the table, she looked out the window. Below, in the part of the grounds she could see from her window, Cashin was speaking to the estate manager about something near the north wall. She could not hear what they were saying. She watched him gesture once, firmly, at something on the papers the manager was holding. She watched the manager nod. She watched Cashin walk a few steps in one direction, stop, make a decision, walk back. It was a very ordinary thing to watch. It was the ordinary daily work of someone managing a large estate. She had watched him do this kind of thing many times over the past month, not because she was following him or arranging to be present, but because this was a working house, and he was always working in it, and the rooms and grounds were only so large. She looked back at the letter. Devonshire, fair terms, a discreet and capable hand, that was her, that had always been her. She picked up her pencil and wrote a short note to Owen, asking him to pass her acceptance to the Dowager Duchess at her convenience. She kept it brief and warm, and without any layer beneath the words that a person reading it would need to address. She sealed it, she set it aside for the afternoon post. Then she sat for a while. Rook had come to lie beside her chair. She put her hand on his head. He was warm and solid, and he smelled like outdoors, and he was, she thought, one of the most quietly decent creatures she had ever been near. "That's enough," she said to him or to herself. It was the same thing, "That's enough of this." He looked up at her. His eyes were the color of river water in autumn, and they had the quality she had noticed the first night, the quality of something that meant what it was directly, without translation required. She scratched behind his ear. He closed his eyes. She would be gone in 2 weeks. There was packing to do, there was the matter of the coach, there was a letter to write to Mrs. Hartley confirming details. There was the next thing, already taking shape, already asking her to be competent and practical and present. She was good at that, she would do it well. She would not think about libraries in the late afternoon, or men who turned pages they were not reading, or the particular silence of 2 people in a room choosing not to say what the room already knew. She would not think about that. She began to make a list of things to pack. It helped the list making, it was concrete, it was task, she was good at tasks, she had always been good at tasks. She was not going to be sentimental about a house she had spent 4 weeks in. She was not going to be sentimental about a dog. She was absolutely, under no circumstances, going to be sentimental about a man who was engaged to another woman and had made no declaration, and had done nothing wrong, and had every right to live his life exactly as it had been arranged. She wrote down her blue wool dress. She wrote down the 2 books she had borrowed from the library, with a note to return them properly. She wrote down the small glass she used for her morning water. She wrote down nothing she was not going to take with her, because the things you do not write down are the things you know you cannot carry. Cashin went to his mother on a Thursday morning. He chose Thursday because it was a day when Lord Ashford was going to be occupied with business in town, which meant the house would be slightly less full of the situation he was about to address, and because he had been thinking about this conversation since the night in the hallway, and he had decided that continuing to think about it was not going to make it easier, and that the only way through a thing you needed to do was to go through it. He knocked on his mother's parlor door. She called him in. She was at her desk, which was where she always was in the mornings, surrounded by her correspondence with the ordered calm of a general who has already won the battle she is currently fighting. She looked up. She read him in under a second, which she had always been able to do, and which had stopped being unnerving around the time he turned 25, and had started being something he respected even when it was inconvenient. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She put her pen down. She folded her hands. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for conversations she had already prepared for. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "Then I don't have to explain myself." "You do," she said. "Saying it matters, say it." He said it. He was not eloquent about it. He had not rehearsed the words because rehearsing felt like a kind of performance, and he had no interest in performing this. He said what was true. He said it plainly, the way he said most things that mattered. He told her what he understood now that he had not understood 6 weeks ago, which was that he could not build a marriage on the correct arrangement of the correct factors when something inside him had already made a different decision, and that he was not going to pretend the decision had not been made, because he had never been good at pretending things that were not true, and he had not been raised to be. His mother listened. She did not interrupt. That was one of the things about her he had always respected. She was a very good listener, even when she was listening to something she did not want to hear. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "She has nothing," Ilara said finally, "not cruelty, fact." "I know. The Ashford connection resolves 3 things that are going to become serious problems if left much longer." "I know that too. You've thought about all of this." "I've thought about nothing else for 2 weeks." Another quiet. She looked at her folded hands. He watched her do the thing she did when she was processing something, a small, barely visible movement of her jaw, the sign of a woman who was working very hard on something in the part of her mind where the real calculations happened. "The dogs," she said at last, not a question. "Among other things." She looked at him. He said, "I have trusted those dogs with decisions that mattered for 10 years. I'm not going to stop trusting them now because the decision is about me." She was quiet again for a long time. Then she said, "The Ashford connection." He said, "I'll find another way for the connection. It will take time. I have time. Marin deserves." "I know exactly what Marin deserves," he said, "and she deserves better than a man whose attention is somewhere else. That is what I am telling you. That is the honest version of this." His mother picked up her pen, put put it down, picked it up again. She was not going to agree with him easily. He had not expected her to. He did not need her to agree. He needed her to understand, which was a different thing and slower. "This is going to be difficult," she said. "I know. Marin's family. I will speak to Marin first," he said, "before anyone else. That is not negotiable." She looked at him with the expression she had worn at critical moments throughout his life, the look of a woman who was recalibrating, who was taking the situation she had built and putting it into the new shape that the situation was now requiring. It was not a happy expression, but it was not a defeated one either. His mother did not do defeated. "The girl," she said, and he knew from the way she said the word that she meant Inez. "She doesn't know any of this." "No. She's accepted the Devonshire position." He had not known that. He felt it land somewhere behind his sternum and stay there. "When?" he said. "Yesterday," his mother said. "The letter went with Owen's afternoon post." He stood up. His mother looked at him. "I need to speak to Marin first," he said, more to himself than to her. "I need to do this correctly." "Yes," his mother said, "you do." He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned around. "You knew," he said, not accusing, just knowing. "You knew before I did." She looked at him without apologizing. She was not a woman who apologized for reading rooms correctly. She was a woman who made the decisions she had made and then lived with them. "I wanted the right outcome for this family," she said. "I know," he said, "so do I." He left. The conversation with Marin came that afternoon in the garden, by the rose border, which was either a coincidence or her particular kind of honesty about what a conversation in a garden near roses represented, and he thought it was probably the latter. She had requested the walk. She had known. Of course she had known. He thought about her now and understood that she had known for longer than he had admitted it, that she had been sitting with the knowledge and deciding what to do with it, and that what she had decided was to make it easy, which was the most generous and also the most quietly devastating thing anyone had ever done for him. She listened to him the way his mother had listened, fully, without interruption. Then she was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. He said nothing. "I have known for a while," she said, looking at the roses with the expression of a woman who is deciding to be exactly who she actually is, which takes more courage than most things. "I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. I wanted to be certain before I said anything." "I should have." "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, and she said it in a way that was not reassuring so much as it was simply true. "You were trying to do what was right. So was I. We were just trying to do right things that were not going to fit together, and I think we both knew that, and neither of us wanted to be the one to say it first." He stood with that. "The Ashford connection matters," he said. "I will find another way for it." "That's a promise." She looked at him then, and there was something in her expression he had not seen before, not anger, not grief, but a kind of surprised respect, the look of a woman who had not quite expected this. "All right," she said. "Are you?" "I will be fine," she said. "I am always fine." And then, with a small curve at the corner of her mouth that was the most genuinely Marin thing he had seen from her in 3 weeks, she said, "I have other arithmetic." He walked back to the house. He went to the east wing. He knocked on the door. There was a pause, then footsteps. The door opened. Inez stood in the doorway in her plain dress with her hair slightly loose, and she had clearly been packing. There was a trunk open behind her, and she had a wool dress folded over her arm, and she looked at him with an expression that was the most undefended thing he had ever seen on her face, which was to say it still wasn't very undefended at all, but the effort to be defended had dropped by some small, significant amount. "I need to talk to you," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She stepped back from the door. He walked in. Behind him, Rook and Sable came through the door too, without being called, without asking permission, and they settled, immediately and completely, in the middle of the room. They had been home for weeks. This was just the first time the door had been open long enough for everyone to notice. Inez set the wool dress down on the bed. She stood and looked at him and the dogs and the open trunk, and the afternoon light coming through the window in the thin gold way it had in this part of the house, and she did not rush anything, and she did not fill the silence with words she did not mean. He had not planned what to say. He found, standing in the room with the afternoon light and the dogs and her, that he did not need a plan, that plans were for the versions of things you were performing, and this was not a performance. This was the part that came after all the performing had run out of room. He said, "The Devonshire position." "Yes," she said. "I'd like you to stay," he said. A silence. Not the library silence, the careful one, the deliberate not looking. This was different. This was the silence of two people standing in the same room after the room has stopped pretending to be anything other than what it is. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at the dogs without theater. "Why?" she said. It was not a challenge. It was just the question she was asking, and she was asking it because she needed the honest answer, and she knew she was going to get one, and she was ready for it. He told her. He said it the way he had said it to his mother, plainly, because that was the only way he knew how to say the things that mattered. He said he had been watching her for 4 weeks without meaning to, and with increasing intention. He said he had sat in the library for an afternoon and turned pages he did not read. He said he had stood at the corner of the garden wall on a morning he still thought about, and understood something that had taken him too long to admit. He said the dogs had known before he did, and he had trusted the dogs for 10 years, and he was not going to stop trusting them now. She listened. She did not fill in the spaces. She did not perform a reaction. She let it land where it was going to land, which was the most honest thing anyone had ever done for him in the middle of a declaration. Then she said, "I accepted the Devonshire position." "I know," he said. "The letter can be recalled. You've spoken to your mother. This morning. And Lady Marant. This afternoon." She looked at the wool dress on the bed, then she looked at him. "I want things," she said slowly, like she was testing the weight of the sentence before she trusted it. "I have always been careful about wanting things. It was the way I survived." "I know," he said. "I don't know how to not be careful," she said. "You don't have to know how yet," he said. "You just have to tell me if you want to try." Another silence. This one was different from all the previous ones. This one had a warmth in it, a possibility. The kind of silence that is not the absence of words, but the presence of something that words have not yet caught up to. She looked at him. He looked at her. Rook, from the middle of the floor, made the low sound he made when he was completely at ease. Not a word, not a signal. Just a dog breathing slowly in a room where everything had finally arrived at where it was supposed to be. Sable put her head on her paws. Inez said, "I'll need to write to Mrs. Hartley." He said, "I know." She said, "It will be an awkward letter." He said, "I'll help you with it if you want." She looked at him. Something in her face shifted by a small amount, the amount that meant she was not going to be careful about this particular thing, not right now. "All right," she said. That was the word, that small, honest word. Not a grand gesture, not a performance of feeling, not the kind of thing you put in a story to make it sound bigger than it was. Just all right, from a woman who had learned to live in a small country and had decided, cautiously and entirely for herself, to try a larger one. He stayed. Outside the window, the grounds were going gold in the late light. Below, somewhere near the kitchen garden, a bird decided something and then changed its mind. The house breathed around them. The trunk stayed open. The wool dress stayed on the bed. And Rook and Sable stayed exactly where they were, in the middle of the floor, not because they had been told to, not because they were following anyone's lead. They stayed because this was where they had been going since the first night they had crossed a room full of candles and silverware and careful arrangements, and walked past all of it, and lay down at the feet of the one person in the room who had not been waiting to be chosen. She had not been waiting. They had known that too.